It was exactly 12:01 a.m. when the phone rang. The shrill sound echoed through the small house, cutting through the silence like a knife through flesh. Mia jolted awake, her heart pounding as if it had been yanked out of a nightmare and thrust into something far worse. She reached for the phone, her fingers trembling. Who would be calling at this hour? Her eyes darted toward the clock on her bedside table. The digital numbers glowed red, like warning lights. She hesitated. Something in her gut told her not to answer. It was the same feeling she had when she watched a horror movie and wanted to shout at the screen, warning the character not to open the door. But this was no movie, and the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Slowly, she picked up the receiver and brought it to her ear. "Hello," her voice cracked, thick with sleep and unease. For a few seconds, there was nothing but static on the other end, a low hum like the wind rattling through dead trees. And then a voice, cold and distant, whispered through the static. "I'm watching you." Her breath caught in her throat. She pulled the phone away from her ear, her hands trembling as she looked at it, as though the small object could somehow harm her. Then, the phone went dead. For a moment, Mia sat frozen in her bed, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. Her mind raced, trying to rationalize what had just happened. It must have been a prank call, someone messing with her, kids, maybe, or a wrong number. But who would say something like that? "I'm watching you." The words echoed in her mind, sending a chill down her spine. Just as she was about to put the phone down, it rang again. This time, she didn't pick it up. She just stared at it, the shrill sound grating on her nerves. After several long seconds, it stopped. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Her eyes darted toward the window. The curtains fluttered lightly in the breeze, though they had been closed just moments ago. A faint draft brushed against her skin, cold and unsettling. She slid out of bed and tiptoed across the room, peeking out from behind the curtains. The street outside was deserted. No cars, no people, just the flickering glow of a distant streetlight. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe it was nothing. But as she closed the window, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The next morning, Mia tried to push the memory of the call to the back of her mind. But as she went about her day, a sense of unease lingered. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, made her jump. She told herself it was just the after-effects of a sleepless night. By the time nightfall came again, the dread had returned, stronger than before. She double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows, her hands shaking. The house felt different, as if something was off, out of place, but she couldn't figure out what. As the clock neared midnight, Mia found herself staring at the phone. She couldn't stop herself from watching it, waiting for it to ring again. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. 12:01 a.m. came and went. The phone remained silent. She sighed, a mixture of relief and embarrassment washing over her. Of course, nothing was going to happen. It was just a stupid prank call, she thought. But then, just as she was about to turn off the lights, there was a soft knock on the door. Mia froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Who would be at her door at this hour? The knocking came again, a slow, deliberate rhythm that sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't want to answer. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore it, to hide. But curiosity won out. She crept toward the front door, peeking through the peephole. There was no one there. Her stomach tightened. She knew better than to open the door. Yet, against her better judgment, her hand reached for the doorknob. As soon as the door cracked open, the phone rang again, piercing the silence. She slammed the door shut and ran back to the phone, her breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. Without thinking, she picked it up. "Hello?" The same cold voice, whispering through the static. "You shouldn't have opened the door." Mia's blood ran cold. She slammed the phone down and backed away, her hands trembling uncontrollably. The hours ticked by in agonizing silence. Mia sat huddled on her couch, every nerve on edge. She had turned on every light in the house, but the brightness did little to chase away the fear gnawing at her insides. Her eyes flicked toward the clock. 3 a.m. The hour of nightmares. As she sat there, a thought began to creep into her mind, a gnawing suspicion that someone was inside the house with her. The feeling was subtle at first, like the faint tickle of a spider crawling along her skin. But it grew, becoming impossible to ignore. Her heart pounded as she forced herself to move, her legs feeling like lead. She grabbed a kitchen knife, gripping the handle so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The house was small, just a living room, a kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. If someone was in here, she would find them. She moved through the rooms, checking every closet, every shadowy corner. The house was empty, but the feeling remained. Then, as she stood in the hallway, something caught her eye. A figure, just on the edge of her vision, standing in the reflection of the hallway mirror. She spun around, the knife raised, but there was no one there. Her breath hitched. She turned back to the mirror, her pulse racing. The figure was gone, but the phone rang again. This time, she didn't answer. The calls came every night after that, always at 12:01 a.m., always the same voice whispering the same chilling words. "I'm watching you." Mia stopped sleeping. Every noise became a threat, every shadow a lurking figure. She barricaded the doors and windows, but the calls never stopped. No matter how much she pleaded, screamed, or begged, the voice would always return. As the days passed, Mia began to unravel. Her world shrank to the 4 walls of her house, and her mind teetered on the edge of sanity. The fear was constant, suffocating, gnawing at her mind like a disease. She couldn't leave. She couldn't trust anyone. All she had was the voice, the midnight caller, who never revealed who or what they were. And then, one night, the voice changed. This time, it didn't whisper. It laughed. The sound was slow and deliberate, each cackle dripping with malice. It was a laugh that seemed to wrap itself around her, curling like smoke in her lungs until she could barely breathe. Mia dropped the phone and backed away, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. She felt dizzy, her vision narrowing as panic clawed at her from all sides. She had to get out. She couldn't stay here any longer. Grabbing her car keys, she bolted for the door. The engine roared to life, and Mia tore down the empty streets, her hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. The world outside her window was a blur of shadows and dim streetlights. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed to escape. The clock on the dashboard blinked 12:15 a.m., but the calls kept coming. Every few minutes, the phone on the passenger seat would light up, vibrating with the same unknown number. She didn't dare answer it. As she drove further out of town, the landscape became unfamiliar. Endless fields, deserted roads, and thick forests that seemed to swallow the moonlight. There were no cars, no signs of life. Just her, alone in the darkness. Her chest tightened with the realization that she had no destination. Where could she go? The caller had followed her for weeks, had seeped into her every thought, every moment of her life. There was no running from it. Then, up ahead, she saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. Mia slammed on the brakes, her heart jumping into her throat. The tires screeched against the asphalt as the car came to a halt just a few feet from the figure. She couldn't make out any features in the dim light, but it was unmistakably a person, standing perfectly still. Her breath caught in her throat. Was this him? The midnight caller? Without thinking, She reached for the phone. The screen flashed again with the same number, and for the first time, Mia felt a sickening curiosity. She answered. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The line crackled, and then the voice, that same cold whisper, came through once more. "You shouldn't have left." Mia's blood turned to ice. The figure on the road began to move. The figure walked slowly, deliberately, toward her car. Mia's breath hitched in her throat, her body frozen in place. She couldn't move, couldn't think. The caller's words echoed in her mind, repeating over and over. "You shouldn't have left." As the figure approached, she could finally make out its features. It was a man, tall, gaunt, with a face shrouded in shadow. His eyes were black, deep voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. He smiled, revealing teeth that gleamed unnaturally in the darkness. The phone slipped from her hand and fell to the floor as Mia frantically fumbled for the gear shift. Her fingers shook, and her vision blurred with tears, but she managed to shift the car into reverse. Just as she pressed down on the gas, the man's hand slammed against the windshield. A loud, wet crack echoed through the car as his fingers pressed against the glass. He stared at her through the windshield, his eyes boring into hers with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight into her soul. Mia screamed and floored the gas pedal, the car lurching backward as she sped away from him. She glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him chasing after her. But he was gone. The road behind her was empty, as if the figure had never been there. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but she couldn't stop. She drove aimlessly through the night, her mind racing. Nothing made sense anymore. How had he found her? Who was he? And what did he want? The phone rang again. Mia's breath hitched as she looked down at it. The screen flashed with the same number, the same message she had come to dread. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. This time, she didn't say anything. She waited, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice on the other end was no longer cold. It was warm, familiar, almost friendly. "Mia," it said softly, "it's too late." The line went dead. The sun was beginning to rise when Mia finally pulled over on the side of a desolate road. She had been driving for hours, her mind numb with fear and exhaustion. She couldn't go home. She couldn't stay on the road. There was no place left to run. Her phone was silent now, the calls having stopped sometime after the last one. But that only made things worse. The quiet felt oppressive, like the calm before a storm. Mia leaned her head against the steering wheel, her body shaking with silent sobs. She didn't know what to do anymore. She was trapped, caught in some nightmare that had no end. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, something shifted in the air. Mia's skin prickled, a sudden awareness that she was not alone. Slowly, she lifted her head and looked into the rearview mirror. There, in the back seat, sat the man. His black eyes stared at her through the reflection, his lips curling into a slow, twisted smile. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "I told you," he said. "You can't escape." Mia's scream echoed through the empty road as the man reached forward, his cold fingers brushing against her neck. She struggled, her body thrashing, but his grip tightened. The world around her began to blur, the edges of her vision darkening. The last thing she heard before everything went black was the sound of her phone ringing. When Mia woke, she was lying in her bed. The house was quiet. The morning light streamed through the curtains, casting warm shadows on the walls. It was as if nothing had ever happened. For a moment, she thought it was all a dream, a terrible, vivid nightmare. But then, she heard the sound. The phone was ringing. Her heart pounded as she turned toward the bedside table. The phone sat there, the screen flashing with the same number, the same message that had haunted her for days. Mia stared at it, her body frozen in place. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The ringing stopped. And then, the voice. "I'm still here." Mia's life became an unending cycle of terror. No matter where she went, no matter how far she tried to run, the midnight caller always found her. Every night at 12:01 a.m., the phone would ring, and every night the voice would whisper through the static, reminding her that she could never escape. She tried everything. She changed her phone number, moved to a different city, even destroyed the phone altogether. But nothing worked. The calls always returned, no matter what she did. And so, Mia became a prisoner of her own fear. She stopped leaving the house, stopped answering the phone. But even in her silence, the terror remained. The man in the shadows, the voice on the other end of the line. He was always there, watching, waiting. The worst part was that Mia never knew who he was or what he wanted. The caller never revealed his identity, never gave her any answers. He was a faceless presence, an eternal tormentor who fed on her fear and helplessness. And as the years passed, Mia realized the truth. There was no escape. It was a stormy night when the final call came. The rain battered against the windows, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Mia sat in the darkened house, her hands gripping the phone. She knew it was coming. She had been waiting for it. 12:01 a.m. The phone rang. This time, Mia didn't hesitate. She answered it on the first ring, her voice steady for the first time in years. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. And then, for the first time, the voice answered her. "You already know who I am." Mia's heart skipped a beat. The voice was different this time. It wasn't cold or distant. It was familiar. Too familiar. Her own voice echoed through the phone. "I'm you." The line went dead. Mia stared at the phone, her mind reeling. Her thoughts spiraled as the pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place. The midnight caller, the man in the shadows, the voice on the other end of the line. It had all been her. She had been tormenting herself, trapped in an endless loop of fear and paranoia. The calls, the terror, the feeling of being watched. It had all come from her own mind, a manifestation of her deepest fears, her darkest thoughts. The nightmare had been inside her all along. As the realization sank in, Mia felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The fear that had consumed her for so long began to fade, replaced by a cold, empty numbness. The phone rang again, but this time she didn't answer. Mia never received another call after that night. The house was quiet, the phone silent, but the memories remained, lingering in the shadows like a faint echo of the past. Every now and then, Mia would catch herself glancing at the clock, waiting for 12:01 a.m. But the midnight caller was gone, or so she thought, because somewhere, in the deepest corners of her mind, the phone was still ringing, and one day, she knew, she would answer it again.